Thank you, Andrew. I see a few former students and colleagues in the audience, and as those who know me know, academics like to talk, and among academics, I'm known as a talker, and Andrew is trying to make up for that by giving me a few extra minutes. But I want to begin this today. I hope I hit the right button. I can't see anything. You see, does that do it? Yeah. I want to begin today by just saying what we all know. This is a 10-year review, but the main reason for review is not to determine blame and credit for what's happened, but rather to give us insights or lessons or views for the future. And that's the spirit of which I talked to you this morning about trust. Now, a well-functioning financial system is essential for growth and stability of the economy. That may be obvious, but at times we forget it. And I just make the blank statement that dichotomy is a myth. It's a fiction that only exists in textbooks. Inexorably, these two are linked together, and I don't think it does much good to try to unscramble them. So it's important what happens to the financial system. And financial innovation is the mechanism by which we improve our financial systems. And financial innovation is driven, in my view, by three factors: finance science, understanding how finance works, developing models and so forth; technology, computing and so forth; and third, and most important, need. If there isn't need, you can have all the technology that you want, it doesn't get done. And we certainly are in a time of need, so I'm not too worried about that. Now, the current direction, force for innovation, I would say, is what's called FinTech, the major marriage of technology into finance. There are other things going on, of course. So when I refer to FinTech, I'm just referring to financial innovation going forward, even though it's not all there, but it's an important one. Now, the thing that connects with the crisis, if we look at 2008 and on, I don't think I'm going to have to convince you that there was an enormous loss of trust by those who use the financial system, particularly if we distinguish between institutions and retail. We're retail. Institutions are sovereign wealth funds and so forth. That in the retail space, in financial services, there was a great loss of trust. Not only trust in the providers of services, but trust in the regulators of those services. Okay? And the implications of that are quite extensive. The ramifications are still being felt today. I want to refer to those as we look forward. Now, if there's three takeaways from my remarks this morning, I'm not going to tell you what's going to happen. I just want you to think about what could happen, and maybe this will jog you a little. First, it is not the case, the lesson from 2008-9 is it's not the case that financial crisis crushes or damages financial innovation. Certainly in 2008, Andrew mentioned narratives. In 2008, there was a great wave of statements, including one such as from a former chairman of the Fed, that there hasn't been a socially valuable or useful financial innovation since the ATM. I'll come back to that in a few seconds. But in any case, so financial innovation took a real hit, and I think it's fair to say between the regulations and just general behavior that financial innovation at least slowed dramatically, and maybe in some cases was even to some degree reversed. I want to say as a takeaway, this is not the norm. It did happen. I'm not saying it shouldn't have happened. That's for those who review, but it doesn't always happen. So that's the first point I want you to take away. Second, trust is fundamental to financial services. Again, I think most people would agree with that. But I would point out to you today in FinTech, people are saying because of technology, we no longer are going to have to trust. I'll just give you one comment. Blockchain, you all must have heard of that at some level as a thing. Blockchain doesn't require trust. So we can, in essence, trust is an old idea, at least in many parts of finance, so perhaps not as important. I'm going to make hope you'll walk away, I'm going to try to convince you that technology by itself cannot create trust, and that the trust has to come from elsewhere. And the third point is, what will the restoration of trust, trust lost in financial innovation, trust lost in providers, trust lost in regulators, how will that restoration evolution that we will need affect the path of the development of financial services? There is a narrative out there, and I would suggest to you that's not the only one. And so it's not that I'm going to tell you which one, but I hope to give you a few ideas that might stimulate you to think about alternative paths of development to the standard narrative of what goes on. Okay, well, let me jump forward quickly because I do it. Let's deal with this issue of, does crisis always end up in crushing financial innovation? And I don't know why. Maybe today or tomorrow someone will explain to me. This is my problem, not anyone else's. But all the comparisons of 2008, 2009 have all seemed to be to the Great Depression. Now, surely, if you're thinking about major bank failures, I would agree. There's a connection. But if you look across other dimensions, I don't see a heck of a lot of combination. So I'm going to talk about one that's a little nearer, just briefly, the 1970s. I feel like that was just yesterday. I lived in it, but looking out at the crowd, some of you weren't even born then. All right. So what happened just briefly in the 1970s, starting in the US and then doing it? We heard about Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods disappeared. Suddenly, currencies that we hadn't worried about for a generation in terms of risk were all over the place. What else? We had, of course, the oil crises. We had two of them. We didn't know we had to count them. What else we had? Double-digit inflation we hadn't seen since our Civil War. And, of course, with that, double-digit interest rates. There was no mortgage money because Reg Q capped interest rate at 5%. It doesn't take rocket science to say if I can get 10% from the US government with a tax break, that's superior to 5% from a bank. So there was no money, and that hurt housing supremely. What else was going along with the 10% in inflation? 9% unemployment. Maybe not as high as the peak in 2008, 2009, but pretty darn high. And we would love to hear from the I'm going to wreck this thing if I don't get away from it. I'd love to hear the next day or so from those who really have thought about it. What would they have done as a hypothetical if in 2008, 2009 they were also facing 10% inflation? What policies would you have introduced to try to deal with the rest of the crisis? Pretty tricky. And you all know that was called stagflation. And I don't know, again, I'd love to know the answer, but when I called up a few people who I think I respect a great deal in macroeconomics, if we have stagflation again, do we know how to cure it? And I haven't seen anyone write the prescription. So let's hope it doesn't come back. All of this is by means of saying the 1970s is a pretty good candidate for a lot of financial shocks to the system. But let's look what happened in terms of innovation. It was probably one of the largest, certainly in modern times, explosion of financial innovation in the 70s going into the 80s. I've just listed them here. I'm not going through them all. You created insurance markets for financial assets, option markets, the currency markets to deal with all these different things. We had electronic exchanges, money market funds, indexing funds, ERISA. We redid our whole pension system. We got rid of negotiated commissions. By the way, I see some people taking pictures. These slides are available to you if you want them. If there's something you hear interesting, you can get them. We'll arrange it. So there was, negotiated commissions opened the door to the institutionalization of the stock market. And we created a national mortgage market. And I think it's fair, I believe, to say that we've not, since that time, had a period where there wasn't mortgage money in the United States. A little tighter at times, rates up and down, but there's never been anything like what happened in the 70s when money disappeared. And if that's the case, I'll stand corrected. Of course, for those who are bankers, we had the innovation called the interest rate swap, which overnight eliminated forever the risk, one of the biggest risks in bank, if not the biggest, of maturity mismatch when they're serving two types of clients, those who want floating short-term, depositors and those who, understandably, in double-digit inflation and interest rates, may want to lock in their interest rate costs. And banks doing that put themselves in an enormous situation of systematic risk to interest rates. That's not true again. It's gone forever anywhere in the world. Not bad for a simple concept contract, not easy to introduce. So what's this laundry list saying? Just to point out that crisis can sometimes have the opposite impact that it did in 2008-9, which is to stimulate a whole bunch of development of innovations to address it. And I would point out that these innovations, which were subsequently adopted voluntarily around the world in other countries, so they, at some level, that's a vote that people think they're pretty good innovations, unless you think everybody's a masochist. But these innovations have been paying social dividends for the last 4 decades. So that was my first point. Now let me quickly jump to the next one, which is this issue of looking forward. Is trust, how trust is fundamental to financial services, and the question is, can technology by itself create trust? Very quickly, I'm going to try to convince you to the contrary. This is a Galaxy 8 Note. It's not a 9. I'm not going to get a 9. I'll wait for a 10. Samsung's not going to like to hear that, but in any case, this is a Galaxy Note 8. Very, very well known, very sophisticated technology. And if I turned it on and said, "Okay, Google," we all know what that is, it would say, "Listen," and I could ask it a question and in 12, 15 seconds get an answer. This isn't true, so don't worry about me. But imagine I have a really bad knee, really painful, bad, maybe too many miles on it. You know, I've been at it for a while, okay? So I pick up my fancy technology and I say, "Okay, Google, what should I do about my bad knee?" Answer, cut it off. Do you think I'm going to do that? Well, let me ask you. If you were in my seat and you got that, how many people would follow that instruction? Put your hand up. No one. And there are a bunch of millennials in here, so this has nothing to do with whether you're facile with technology, okay? Well, by the way, I've asked this question everywhere in the world, and I've yet to have anybody put their hand up. So this is pretty universal data. Why did I do that? That's my fast pass that technology by itself isn't trusted. I gave you credit. And I just remind you why, because we were hearing about philosophers. You know, we all know everything's a model and that all models are incomplete. There's no such thing as a complete description of reality. Therefore, among other things, they all can fail because they're incomplete. But also, we have to make decisions when we use a model or build a model. What do we put in the model, and most importantly, what do we leave out? Those are judgments. Now, one of the reasons that I don't think I would, or you, follow that advice is you don't know what medical model was in here. By the way, for medical, you can replace it with financial. I just thought medical gets attention, because everywhere, that's a first order. Okay? So you don't know what model was in there. Did it come from the best minds in knee research using lots of important data about me? Or did it come from an internet download somebody threw onto a nice piece of technology? We don't know. What else don't we know? The models have to be populated by data. We don't know what data were used. We don't know if it's dirty data, biased data, or maybe no data at all. But even if we knew the model was good and the data were complete, what else do we need to know? What was the motivation for the builder of this model? Maybe it was a body parts company that was trying to collect supply, not to do the best thing for me. Those 3 things have to be satisfied to use technology. That's my message. And the implications of that for the development of the financial services industry is what I want to try to stimulate you to think about. Because if you accept it's just technology you need, you get, I believe, a very different answer than you will arrive at once you take account that there's more than one factor of production now. Not just technology, but technology and trust. Now, there are many parts of finance that don't need trust, as many other areas. 2 things are substitutes for trust. Transparency. If 2 things are absolutely transparent, I can just compare them myself. I don't need to trust anything. I can see. If I really know they're transparently, that means they're identical. All I have to say is which one's cheaper. And I don't need to trust anything. What's the other way that you can get around having trust? I don't say creates trust as a substitute for trust. That's verification. So payment systems, Alipay and so forth, very few people. I had one person in one audience say that they were actually an advisor to Alipay and knew what was going on under the hood. But most everyone who uses Alipay or Apple Pay or Samsung Pay or any of the pays don't really know what's going on. They certainly don't know what the model is. They're not transparent. They're not transparent at all. So how do we get to use them? Verification. I try it. It works. You try it. It works. All my neighbors try it. It works. So even though it's a black box and I don't know what's inside, I'm willing to use it through verification. If I'm a financial advisor doing advice for this gentleman in the front, my client, and I do spreadsheets half the day, and this gentleman comes in and says, don't do that. Here's the machine. Put it in. You'll put his data in. Out will come the answers for him, and you're done. Okay? I don't know what's in this machine, but what can I do? I can take every spreadsheet I did for the last 10 years for him, run it through here, compare the answers, and see whether they're the same or better. If I get that, maybe through that verification, I'm willing to do it. So things that can be verified don't require trust. So transparency and verification. The thing I want to call your attention to, there's a huge swath of finance, high-level finance, that high-value finance is sometimes called, which is inherently opaque, which means, opaque, not transparent. Well, inherently opaque means it cannot be made transparent. So transparency doesn't work. Then it also turns out there's a whole bunch of it, particularly financial advice, which is not, as a practical matter, verifiable. So financial advice, the big area, and financial advice includes complex financial instruments, solutions that you buy. That's just prepackaged advice. Those are inherently opaque, so they can't be made transparent, and they can't be verified. Those who've never done it, you're not going to like it if you haven't heard it. But here's the question. He's just hired me as his advisor. Question, if he can only look at what happens to his portfolio going forward, no other data, just to simplify it, how many years would I have to manage his money before he could come to a proper, rational, significant conclusion, statistically significant conclusion that I'm a good or bad manager? You understand? I'll say a T-stat of 2. If you don't know what that means, that's a pretty low-level standard for significance. I don't think any of the professionals in this room would hire me with a T-stat of 2, okay? And you certainly couldn't get any drugs approved with a T-stat of 2 or p-value that large, okay? So that's not a high standard. 5 years? 3 years? Anybody? 40 to 400 years, depending on what date I give you. The point of the matter is, that's my point. It's not, as a practical matter, verifiable. You may not like it. By the way, an AI machine will give you the same answer because it'll use the same formula. And it'll, T-stat is a T-stat or a p-value is a p-value. So the point being, financial advice is a big area in which it's inherently opaque. So what are you left with? You're left with no other choice but trust. It's not an option. It's the only solution. Now, I want to remind you about trust. I'm watching the clock, Andrew. I want to remind you about trust, that there are two components to trust. Usually you say trust, you think trustworthy. One of my grown children is in the room, okay? And I trust him and his siblings with my life making decisions if I can't. Maybe I shouldn't, but I do. But I wouldn't let him or his siblings near me with a scalpel to fix my knee. Why? Because they don't have the competence. So I remind you, trust is not just trustworthy, it's trustworthy and competence. And that's what makes it very, very complicated. Now, FinTech is going to, as my example, improve efficiency, lower costs, allow me to do my job better and for more people. But there's a price. And the price is, as you saw, it gets more opaque. Every time we put a black box in, It was less transparent to me. Surely not transparent. He just trusted me. That's the only reason he picked me as his advisor, not because he understands any of it or could. And I'm including my 150 IQ, 3 PhD nanotechnology colleagues at MIT. So it's not about education, all right? So, when we look at this, we say, okay, we get this increased efficiency, but we get an increase in opaqueness. I would suggest you to think about what does that make the value of happen to the value of the trust asset as technology comes in? Does it go up or go down? I would suggest it probably makes the trust asset even more valuable because of the greater opaqueness. Okay? If that's true, that's a very different story than the one that advisors are often being told today. You better look for another job because technology is going to replace you and you're going to be out of it. In fact, if you have the trust asset, however you produce it, I'm not going into that. I mean, I'll give you some suggestions, but then, okay? But whoever has the trust asset, technology is going to make them better off. They're going to be more valuable. They're going to be able to do more. My physician could treat me in Singapore because of technology. My physician at the Mass General in Boston, okay? And the same thing with financial advice. So I think that's one direction to see it. Do I have a few more minutes, Andrew? Yeah, okay. I have to show data. I mean, look, you can't trust this. People say, it's kind of a nebulous thing. How would you measure it? So I've got two pieces of data here, or two sets of data, that I just want to show you that might give you an indication that relates to the crisis. Remember, we started by saying the crisis, we lost trust. And we lost trust both in competence as well as trustworthiness. Trust with the providers, we lost it because I won't name which well-known bank, had 3 million accounts that nobody knew about, that they were taking money out. That's loss of trustworthiness. We know that there were senior managements of major institutions who didn't understand the risk in their own institution. That's incompetence. Among regulators, we know there was the notion of regulatory capture. I think that's self-statement of loss of trustworthiness. And then there's the question of whether the regulators had the resources and the knowledge to understand the complexity of those who they regulate. That's competence. So all the way through, we had that. Now, 2018, CFA Institute, two questions they asked about that were important. Disclosure of fees, how much does it cost to get services, and performance. How am I doing? Am I getting good performance? In terms of importance, the dark blue, retail's on the left, institutional on the right. Very important, both those. Very important to the institutions. But look at the satisfaction. Institutions are pretty satisfied with the financial services they're getting, at least according to the survey. Retail is not. That's, to my mind, at least suggests a bifurcation in the impact of trust. That it's not uniform across the services, but makes a big difference at retail. These are there. Now, last data on this is a trend. And for those of you, this is a hypothesis because I haven't done enough work. I'm showing you all the data. But maybe some student or maybe some faculty member who wants to do some research, if you can do a better job of it. And this is the following. Starting before the crisis in 2007, we look at the change in assets under management in mutual funds. This is all retail. So we're not talking about sovereign wealth funds or anything, just retail. Look at the flow, net flow of assets into index funds and ETFs, which are essentially index funds. That's the upper graph. The bottom graph is the flow into active investing. That's where people use models, advice, judgment, phone calls to everybody, wig boards, whatever, behavioral advance, data scraping, any kind of thing you want to try to be able to beat markets. Now, the way to think of indexing is it's a mechanical rule that's fully specified, there's no choice, and it's completely transparent because you can look at the portfolio and see if they're following the rule by the accounts, and you can look at the returns and see if they're doing the benchmark. So you can both verify as well as have transparency. Therefore, I would argue, since the custodian holds the assets so that the indexer can't run off with the money, you don't really need trust. Vanguard is a great company, but you don't need to trust Vanguard if you're holding their index funds, okay, for the most part. The bottom one active investing, by its nature, is inherently opaque. I can't make it transparent even if I wanted to, and most people don't want to because they'd be giving away their technology. So the reason I show this is not to talk about, can active and passive beat each other. That was an equilibrium in 2007. There were people in 2007 who believed indexing was best, and there were people in 2007 who thought active investing was best. The ones who thought indexing were best, when trust was lost, they didn't care. They didn't have to change their strategy because it wasn't based on trust. But the ones who believed in active investing had to trust. And if that was lost, it's not that they didn't think that if they could trust someone that it can be done. It's just they can't find anyone to trust. Then what are you going to do? And my hypothesis is you look for the best you can do, subject to the constraint you don't trust. And I think you end up with indexing. Warren Buffett, who's hardly an advocate of passive investing for himself, has said that if his widow did it, she'd be pretty okay. So the point being, I think this is evidence, it could be, it's a hypothesis, that suggests how much trust has been lost in the retail area. This is after 8 years of bull market. Let's forget about the last few months, okay? So this is not people getting risk averse. This is a trend, and it's just enormous. $1 trillion swing each way, okay? And that's just in the US. So I hope that at least stimulates you to the idea of that trust is a pretty important thing as an empirical matter. Now, someone says, well, how are you going to instill trust? We kind of think, find good people who are trustworthy. Yeah, sure, that doesn't work too well institutionally. But there are business models, and many that have been developed, designed to engender trust, at least in the trustworthy age. Fee-only financial advisors, independent financial advisors, who only take money from their client and will not take commissions, fees, Rolex watch gifts, or vacations for their family to the Caribbean, as a business model, not because they're, quote, good people. That's their business model. Why? It's all to get you to trust them without knowing them for 25 years or being a member of your family. So I'm trying to say there are business model designs to build trust. And I'm saying I think that's a great value thing to be considered. That's what I want to bring. Okay, what's the other? And I'm going to have to quit on this. Regulation. Regulation is there in part to create trust. We have an FDA for drugs. We do it with finance. Okay, and the question is, how are we in the world of FinTech going to restructure and do regulations so as to engender trust, but not to either lose the trust through incompetence or to stalemate the benefits of the technology? A challenge, but a challenge I believe in. The last picture here is a picture of financial innovation since the 12th century. And you don't have to look at the details. The picture shows you all. What is it showing you? How fast the compression of time over all this period with major innovations. And one, that's just to say, times from the past, don't use the historical time frames for how long it took to project to the future, because they aren't the same. But I also use this to remind myself, these are tough times, and we have lots of uncertainties, but they've always been tough times and lots of uncertainties. And, we had Bretton Woods, as we heard in the previous thing, in 1944, and it went away in the 1970s, but we didn't exactly have everything else go away. So I would say I'm rationally optimistic that in the long enough run, that's always what we economists say when we don't want to be pinned down to a very definite forecast when it will happen. In the long run, I think it will work. But I hope that from these comments that you'll think about there are two factors of production. And we learned in first year micro, or we teach it, when you have two factors of production, it's an interesting question. How will the factor shares be in the output? Labor and land, labor and capital. How about trust and technology? Is it going to be a lot going to technology and a little to the trust asset? Or could it be the other way? I remind you, technology is a competitive industry. At least I think it is. If he's got a better mousetrap, the three behind you are trying to build a better mousetrap, and there are no real barriers to entry. So think about that as a micro problem when you're trying to forecast which assets and who is going to do well going forward as we develop the innovation to improve things, okay? Whether you're an investor or a user or a regulator. Thank you very much.
Have a seat over there. I'm going to have you Q&A.
Okay.
I think we all agree that in Bob we trust and that he's got plenty of competence. So since both of our morning speakers were so good at keeping time, we actually have a little bit of extra time. So I'd like to ask Harold if you can come up and have a seat and maybe grab that microphone on your way up. And Bob, you already have your microphone, so you're all set. We have some time for the audience to ask questions of both of our speakers. So if you wouldn't mind, please raise your hand and identify yourself. And as a moderator, I have the right to stop any kind of pontification that may go on. So please, if you're going to ask a question, make it a question. Steve? Can you identify yourself, please?
Right?
So maybe this financial advice in particular is a industry where there is no possibility of trust like you're asking.
Fair enough. I think we'll make this into we can make this into a real seminar. But let me just respond. I was very careful to say the restriction was the only thing that Peter could look at was his own portfolio data. Obviously, if I use benchmarks and a whole bunch of things, which is what's used in the real world, sophisticated people, and there are a bunch of them sitting here, I recognize them, can, with a lot of work, try to pick good managers, but people are paid millions of dollars a year to pick managers with good track records from the past who they think will go to be good managers in the future. And you see that the institutional side that does this seems pretty satisfied. So I think that there's at least some evidence to suggest that, yes, you can do better than 40 years, but it's hard to do. And in fact, when you do it, it requires a lot of knowledge and judgment, and clearly people disagree. So I'm saying that the message from this is you can't verify it the way you can a payment system, you know, that you do a payment and so forth. Do you understand? That's what I was trying to compare it to. I don't say it's impossible to get some estimates of verification, but I just wanted to get that across because people, I think most people who don't know think, gosh, after 5 years, I'm certainly going to know. And the answer is you're not close, okay? And that's the message, and that's the message you get out of an AI machine.
Next. Let's see. Back there. I don't know if we can wait for the mic. It's coming to you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Mark Weatherly. I'm with Deloitte. I was at OMB during the crisis. I have a question. It was interesting you showed that graph and the difference between trust among institutional and retail investors. And I'm wondering if you have a view on the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau as to whether that is a way for retail investors to gain trust and whether it's been successful.
That's just for me, I assume. Okay. I have lots of opinions. I haven't studied scientifically all the data and everything with respect to the consumer industry to give you a professional opinion. But what I will say is the following, and I did say, I think, regulation, however it's done, is an important component of the trust factor. And if it's done well, it's good. If it's not done well, it's not good, okay? But more importantly, I wanted to get across that contrary to what a lot of people think, which is either doing the right thing, doing the trusted thing, or making lots of money is a conflict. And sometimes it is. I'm trying to say it's a good business model if you've got value to add. Now, if you don't have value to add, that's different. But if you have value to add, I'm trying to convey to you, building a business model around trust to go with and be complemented by whatever regulatory agencies will do is, I think, the way that it has to be done, and it's important. I don't believe that a regulatory agency has enough information or power or resources to be a substitute for it being done in the provider sector with competition.
Okay, over here.
Thanks. Doug Breeden. Bob, I thought some also about trust, and I remember back in the good days when we were buying lots of homes for our kids, I thought of caring, sharing, and trust. I remember even writing something about that, and I wondered if you'd thought about the micro type of implications of, like, if you bought a vacation home and you shared it with your children or with friends, that would be a very efficient thing to do, in that vacation homes are often not used by a lot of people. So I wondered, in kind of optimal consumption and spending rules, whether who you care about affects what you could purchase, and how and trust would be a part of that consumption decision. Anyway, I don't know. Wild idea, Bob.
Okay, first let me be clear. I was brought up, I think, like most everyone here, with a vision or mission, or taught to be a trustworthy, caring person. And I try, but I don't always succeed, and probably a lot of those others do it. I was trying to distinguish from that, Doug, which is very important, to trust here, seeing it as an asset, purposely for the reason that I'm trying to keep them separate. So I would say those are important and issues, but that's not what I was referring to here. I'm trying to purposely separate the two so that people can see that it's actually a good strategy, that you're not having to make the usual ethical trade-offs that are often raised, which exist, of course, but I don't think are the preponderance when you're thinking about strategic decisions of how to run a financial services organization, that you can just look at it from the point of view.
Over here.
Good morning, Ian Shore. Recently, the CEO of Jefferson Medical Center made the statement that artificial intelligence may make you smarter, but will never make you wiser. I assume you would agree with that assertion?
Well, yes. And in fact, I have a colleague, a business colleague who I have great respect for, who says AI should not be called artificial intelligence, but assisted intelligence, as a means of conveying that in one way or another, human beings are essential. In one remark that I put up there about models, I was trying to take a shorthand to say you can't get around the fact that a good model for a particular application is fundamentally dependent on the assumptions you make, the abstractions and the things you leave in and out. Watson and Crick made abstractions that ended up being DNA. Linus Pauling made different ones. Linus Pauling only had one Nobel Prize at the time, ended up with two, but not for what we call DNA. Okay, so they made the right abstractions. As far as I know, and I call that the art of the science because it doesn't just apply to finance and economics, it applies to physics, chemistry, and FinTech, okay? That we can't get around that. And that part of it is where it's extremely difficult to find an AI that I know of, or anybody even developed, that's remotely close to doing those kinds of abstractions. Data scraping will certainly not do it for you alone. So I'm trying to answer, in the spirit of the way I answered Doug Breeden, that in the context of what I was saying, that's how I would frame that, why the AI is not a substitute for people.
Yeah. Harold?
Yeah, this is on. I think that's a fascinating question, and I think you can also learn something from the story of industrial revolutions in the past. If you think of the manufacturing revolution, there was really a substitution of energy from carbon sources for human or animal labor. And as a result of that, people got healthier, but weaker. So you didn't need the kind of muscle that you needed in the pre-industrial world, but improved health levels. And I think you can have an exact analogy from that to the world of AI, in the sense that a lot of operations that we used to do and we used to enjoy, driving on a road somewhere and finding the right way, we don't have to think about anymore. And collectively, I think that actually has the big possibility of making us stupider rather than smarter. And you see it in, I think, many, many areas. And maybe you shouldn't undersell what AI is going to do to medical diagnostics also. I mean, I think, the medical diagnoses will be more sophisticated than cutting your knee off.
So
Yes.
Harold, to follow up on that, you use the analogy that, winter's coming. What is the equivalent of dragon glass that's going to allow us to defeat the White Walkers? What happens in the vast expanse of history that has shown how this deglobalization trend ultimately gets reversed?
I think, first of all, there is a fundamental cooperative impulse. And people are also capable of learning by looking at bad outcomes. But unfortunately, one of the things I think is that it's very, very difficult to get people to respond to challenges that they haven't personally experienced. And so, the further you are from these catastrophic events like the world wars, the more difficult it is to believe that something like that can happen again. And maybe you need a bit more imagination. You need to look to history, or you need to look to other areas of the world where you can see exactly the effects of conflict and of increasing nationalism and pushing back on the
Maybe
on
a
the
review
corruption.
article, perhaps. Huh? So, yes.
Thank you, Rick Ross, an interested alum. I couldn't see the slide on evolution to the far right where it was small. Was blockchain there? That is to say, is it possible to have a technology solution to trust? Or on the international scene, is this something that promotes distrust, looking at how Venezuela was able to shirk some of their bond responsibility by issuing a cryptocurrency? So is the blockchain a solution to trust, or does it promote distrust, as we might have seen?
Why don't you both answer? But Bob, you
Okay.
start.
I would point out the following thing, that blockchain doesn't grow out of the ground like a tomato. And it's not gold, meaning I can subject it to well-accepted experiments that will tell you it's gold. Okay? Blockchain is an idea. And then eventually, if I came to you and say, I have a blockchain solution, how do you know, one, whether it was a good version of blockchain, the model was programmed and designed was a good one, the best that there is, or a crummy one? How do you know what data is used? And how do you know whether I put a trap door that after all your money is in there, I can open it and empty it? That's trustworthiness. In practical terms, since I want to give you right the moment, Ripple, I'm just not plugging any one of them, found out the blockchain is so bloody slow, it couldn't do it. So it had to put a referee in. Instead of going all the way back to the beginning of time for every transaction, it said, well, we'll just go back far enough and we'll have a referee who says it's okay. That's trust. Now, how you create trust is one thing. What I'm saying is the idea that blockchain doesn't require trust implicitly assumes that you're assuming the model, the data, and the motivation of what built this thing are all okay. And that's what I'm calling into question. And that's the reason I think you all didn't put your hand up, is just to finish, had I gone to my hospital with the doctor I do trust and gone to a second one for a second opinion, if they all told me that if I wanted to be around in a year, I'm going to have to lose my knee, I would do it. So it's not that I wouldn't do it. I would do it if I had the trust, however it's created. And that's the element. I don't think you can get around that, but maybe someone can show me the mechanism.
Harold?
Yeah, I think there is a kind of wish to trust technology, and so it's exactly that pushes, at the moment when you have a big innovation with all kinds of potentially really good uses like blockchain technology, but it pushes also, because there's a naive trust in technology, it pushes, for instance, in your case, exactly pariah states to want to use this, and they see it if there's a kind of alternative to the existing system. And so if you if you look where the blockchain discussion is particularly active, in Belarus, enormous amounts of activity in blockchain, in Venezuela, that it's exactly there that it's taking place.
Yeah, can I just add?
Yes, Bob.
I just want to be very clear. I'm not opposed to using blockchain technology. I think it has great possibilities. I'm just saying it can't satisfy that objective. That's the thing. I don't want to sound as I'm anti any of this. I've been doing FinTech for 50 years. Anyway, go ahead.
I think we have time for one last question. Back there?
Hi, Wilson Irvin from Credit Suisse. A question primarily for Harold. A lot of the deglobalization has happened in Europe, which is kind of strange given there's at least some common legal framework, some common institutional framework, a common currency. So strange that deglobalization would be centered there. Mario Draghi has talked about how a lot of the forces that have come in place since the crisis made it harder for him to operate a monetary policy that works all through the union. But the euro actually still remains popular even in parts of the union that have had tough economic performance. So I'm curious as to your call from here. We're sort of stuck in a half banking union that's going a bit backwards right now, but there are forces trying to move it towards a more unified, to reverse that flow. What do you think of Mr. Draghi's chances?
The story about the deglobalization of European finance was really a story of the very, very early stages of the financial crisis, so an immediate reaction to 2008. That was really a story of institutional incompleteness because the banking regulation was a national issue at that point. And so it's really only in 2012 that you move to a Europe-wide system. And the banking union is still incomplete in that sense. The national pressures are still very much there. But that's exactly the bet of Mario Draghi. But on the other hand, you really can't do it without the politics. And so a lot can be done at a technical level, but it really can't be done without the work of France and Germany and the rest. And that's exactly the question that I think is still very much open, because they're responding to a whole series of crises. It's not just the financial crisis, the debt crisis, but it's the security crisis, environmental challenges, energy challenges. There's a big recognition that there are really big collective goods here. But it's incredibly difficult to get this stuff to organize, and so that's the challenge for the future. But it's a political one rather than, I think, simply a technical one.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we are out of time, so please join me in thanking our morning speakers.